Can you imagine seeing that on a new building? That's a quote by Virgil. The noblest motive is the public good. Another of my favorite inscriptions is on a Whittier middle school. And you see it on a wall as you approach the building. It says, "What you would have in the life of a state, you must first put into its schools." Von Humboldt. Wilhelm von Humboldt was the creator of the Prussian school system in the 19th century, which is why Germany became a great power. All right, 1944, Roosevelt was still alive. We get the GI Bill of Rights, which is a New Deal program, really. What a phenomenal democratization of education. The veterans, when they came back, could actually go to these new schools and colleges. Built entire college campuses, by the way, like Santa Rosa Community College, complete campus built from scratch. Los Angeles, Pasadena, San Bernardino, these are all New Deal projects. So they were ready when the vet came back. In 1948, largely thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that education is a universal right and that children are entitled to education. I've been wondering whether, because the United States signed on to that, the Universal Declaration of Rights, actually whether that's part of our Constitution, although we know that the Constitution doesn't mean anything anymore, especially after New Year's Eve. But I will come back to that. 1960, the California Plan. Jerry Brown's father was a New Dealer, as Lyndon Baines Johnson, and so you can look at the master plan as another sort of belated aspect of democratization of education that comes out of the New Deal. All children, all Californians are entitled to a quality public education. I took advantage of that. I'm kind of ashamed now because, you know, the New Deal almost self-acted. Within just a few years after these things were put in, like fresh water for all, clean water, we all took it for granted. We forgot where it came from. And it's not just the Roosevelts. It's those millions of honest workers who created that stuff. You know, the CCC board, UPWA workers, they need to be honored too. There needs to be a monument, museum to the workers of the New Deal. We've got, you know, there's this horrible excrescence on the Capitol Mall now, which they honor the veterans of the Second World War. How ironic. It could have been designed by Albert Speer, but there is no monument or museum to the workers of the New and what they did and what they left for us. All right, Master Plan 1960, all the activism of the free speech movement, and then the late 60s, which I've been on. There was all that activism, and then in 71, something happens that was very important. How many of you read the Lewis Powell memo or know of it? Interesting. You do. Good. Okay. Lewis Powell was a corporate attorney who was upset. I think he was in Southern California. He was very upset, as were many people of his class, about the activism of the 1960s, early 70s, and was determined to do something about it. Just a few months before Richard Nixon named him to the U.S. Supreme Court, he wrote a long memo to the Education Committee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he said that essentially what was going on in the schools and the campuses undermining the American way of free enterprise, and that we had something about that. He lays out a long march through the institution about how we will change the language and thus change people's by essentially changing the system and the mass media. And that was phenomenally successful. That was 40 years ago, the Lewis Powell memo. It basically is the genesis of things like the Cato Institute, the Foundation, the Free Enterprise, a parallel system of right-wing think tanks that can counter the left wing, what they perceived as left wing in the American university system, also whatever happened below that as well too. And they've been incredibly successful in changing the entire and narrowing the parameters of what can be discussed. So in the 1970s, these think tanks, very well funded, began to be set up. The 1980s, of course, 1978, here in California, Prop 13, which the firing gun of the tax revolt. The 1980s, real rise of the far right, both here and in Britain. Maggie Thatcher there, Ronald Reagan, the great pitchman here. And things that Reagan did. When you read or listen to Roosevelt, when he talks about government, he talks about it in the first plural. It's we or us. Reagan did something very interesting. Them or it. That's incredibly corroding democracy right at its roots. It becomes the enemy. At the same time, they got the fairness doctrine in the mass media, began deregulating mass media so they can concentrate media monopoly that Ben Bagdikian documented so well. You don't have to have fairness anymore. You begin getting the rise of far right and hate talk radio, which of course now just dominates the dial. I was on Public Affairs TV at that time, and in KQED, they got rid of that, so you don't have shows like that anymore. This is what I'm talking about, omission. People simply don't know anymore. KQED's Newsroom, phenomenal news show. They got rid of that. Now what's on primetime TV? Things like Antiques Roadshow, rather than smart people talking about what's going on in current events. 1986 is the first known use of the term starve the beast. It was voiced by an unknown person in the White House on the staff. It summarized the idea of if you can just starve government of its resource through tax cuts and shifts, et cetera, well, Tina, there's no alternative. There's no money in the bank. So starve the beast is incredibly effective. And of course, it was taken to a high arm by Bush II by launching wars at the same time having tax cuts. That's a great way for just bankrupting your government, but you can't do things, with a major exception, which I'll come back to soon, which, of course, President Eisenhower warned us about. In 1995, one of the idols of the right wing, Milton Friedman, wrote a position paper for the Cato Institute, one of the think tanks that comes out of the Lewis Powell. I'm just going to read you the first few sentences of it. This is a Cato briefing paper. It says, our elementary and secondary educational system needs to be radically restructured. Such a reconstruction can be achieved only by privatizing a major segment of the educational system. That is, by enabling a private for-profit industry to develop that will provide a wide variety of learning opportunities and offer effective competition to public schools. This is 17 years ago. But he says it's so radical that it has to be done gradually. So that, because if it was done right away, of course, people wouldn't have accepted it. This is the boiling in the pot. And this has largely been, all we've been talking about comes out, first of the Lewis Powell and then this Cato briefing paper. Okay? So then in 2000, we get our coup d'etat, we get Bush II, of course. 9/11 happens soon thereafter. And with 9/11, we get things like the Homeland Security and the Patriot Act, et cetera. We get rapidly increasing militarization, securitization, and surveillance, and these have become phenomenally profitable, as well as great way for keeping, well, malcontent, such as all of us here, in line. The Occupy movement, for example. We did, in California, briefly would-be Democratic governor before he was thrown out for a bionic action. That was Gray Davis, who appointed his good buddy and funder, Richard Blum, the private equity capitalist, husband, billionaire of Dianne Feinstein, on the board of regents. Richard Blum is the alpha regent on the regents. None of the regents have any experience in education. Are basically millionaires to billionaires, such as Richard Blum, but as George and others have said, they all have very certain ideas what education should be. They are Lewis Powell's idea and Milton Friedman's about what education should be, and one of them should be is profitable, very profitable themselves. So what we've seen is that for the last few years, since Richard Blum came in, actually was going on before then, it's just accelerating, is the dismantling of the University of California. And this is very interesting. I have actually an article in this week's Bay Guardian called Exporting Our Brains about how the Chancellor of UC and the Dean of the College of Engineering, while the professors and students were being beaten by the cops on Sproul Plaza on November 9th, where were they? They were in Shanghai signing an agreement with the Chinese to open a new branch of the UC Department of Engineering to export our technical expertise to our witty rivals there. China wants to build a rival to Silicon Valley over there in Shanghai at the office park, and we're going to help them for a price. So is Duke, so is NYU. They're all opening branches over there. And as the article in the New York Times said, the UC schools of business and law are also thinking of opening partnerships with the Chinese over there. The deans of all of those schools at Berkeley, UC, engineering, law, and business are all very good friends of Regent Blum, and in fact serve on the Blum Center for Developing Economies, which is a building right next to mine that just sort of dropped out of the sky like an alien mothership and is there, right there, and nobody quite seems to know what it does. It studies poverty and its remediation in places other than here, in developing countries. It doesn't study de-developing countries such as this one and why it's happening, and how Richard Blum is profiting handsomely from that, as is his wife. I'm getting close to the end now, but there's so much more to talk about. Probably some of you know that an independent investigative reporter, Peter Byrne, did a magnificent series of articles called Investor U on Regent Blum and others, but particularly Regent Blum's conflicts of interest and their unethical, how unethical they are, and how one of Regent Blum's chief fields of investment is for-profit colleges. He has $500 million in one of them. And how on the investment committee of UC, he has invested the university's money in his own companies. Odd, isn't it? I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Schwarzenegger was involved too. So this came out online. It came out in alternative papers. The Chronicle. What? Peter Byrne, B-Y-R-N-E, Peter Byrne. You can go to his site. Just Google Investors Club. The Chronicle was supposedly going to publish an abbreviated version of this, except that they just lawyered it to death. They lawyered it for month after month. In April, the student paper at UC Santa Barbara ran a quote by me. I'm going to read it because the Metro Desk editor at the Chronicle called me the moment it came out and implied that it was libelous, and then called the editor at the Santa Barbara paper and told him it was libelous, so he took it out. So since it's libelous, I'd like to repeat it right here. Peter Byrne previously investigated conflicts of interest between Regent Richard Blum and his wife, Senator Dianne Feinstein. Those articles, like his current work, never appeared in the Blum-Feinstein home newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. That hardly surprises me, since the couple is now one of the most powerful in the United States. They move in the very highest of San Francisco's political and society circles. You can see how libelous that is. Obviously, it's false, except that they proved it right after a few months more because they spiked the article. It never appeared because Regent Blum, well, I don't think it was because, he was threatening to sue them if it went into the newspaper of record. So they spiked it. And this is what I mean by omission is more powerful than commission, because anybody who's reading the Chronicle doesn't know what they're not reading or allowed to read. The Chronicle always covers for Feinstein and Blum. While we're at it, I did have a PI look at, do an SEC filing for Richard Blum's companies, and it's a vast octopus. It reaches out. There's one company I would very much like to know about, and it's called Stinson Capital Cayman Islands. Especially after Mitt Romney is getting a lot of attention. What is U.S. Senator's husband doing, having a company in the Cayman Islands? Isn't that interesting? As well as, what is that building next to mine and what's going on there? All the ley lines of power seem to be crossing through the Blum Center now on the UC campus, like getting rid of our libraries, for example, if they're not profit centers. Finally, the UC administration likes to talk about the 10 campuses of the University of California. Remember how when we got the master plan of higher education, at that time we were building new campuses, and then that stopped with Prop 13, and since then only one campus has been opened, and that was Merced, and there are obviously not going to be any more. They're actually talking about maybe closing some, like Riverside, for example, which is where the water archives went. Let's close some of them. UC Med Center is now thinking of spinning itself off as a for-profit thing. So it's part of all of what's going on. But they don't talk about the 12 campuses, because there really are 12 campuses. If you go to the UC Administration Center here in Oakland, you'll see photographs, beautiful color photographs of all 12 of the campuses, the ones you hear about, and then the other ones you don't hear about at Livermore and Los Alamos, New Mexico. The two weapons labs that were set up to compete with one another to develop the most efficient and effective means of destroying our planet. They were set up to compete with one another. And what is going on there at those two campuses? There was an article in The Guardian, which wasn't reported here, a few months ago, that the United States has committed itself to spending in the next 10 years $800 billion to develop new generations of nuclear weapons. $800 billion over 10 years. This is not in the military budget, it will be in the Department of Energy. And who's in charge of the Department of Energy? Stephen Chu of UC Berkeley, of the national labs there. So very quietly, $800 billion that could be going into education in the other 10 campuses are going to be going to job security in the two shadow campuses, which are tied in with what Eisenhower should have called the military-industrial academic complex, because it's not UC that's managing those labs anymore, it's Bechtel. When the contracts were renegotiated, Bechtel came in and is managing those laboratories, along with the Washington Group and a number of others, and Blum is involved in those as well, too. So you can see how it's all tightly tied together. Meanwhile, this once great university, not just the university, of course, the community colleges, state universities, and perhaps most painful of all, the K-12 system upon which all of the higher education rests, it's all being dismantled. We've heard about it all today. It is breaking my heart to watch this happen. I'm a Californian, I've benefited from it, and it's just tragic to watch this happening and to hear the lie repeated over and over again. Tina, there is no alternative. The New Deal shows that there was an alternative, there could be an alternative, but you have to know that it existed and that it worked. And that's why I do what I do. Two articles on how these for-profit colleges snare the students with government-guaranteed loans. They have a very high default on them because, of course, they don't fulfill the promise of getting lucrative employment when they get out. There's a high dropout rate, and many of them can't get jobs after they get out. So there's a high default, but they're government guaranteed. So it's very, very profitable for the companies because they can't lose. In neither of those articles did she mention that the named culprit in it, whose name now escapes me, the majority shareholder is Richard Blum, in that even though she had that information on her desk, because she was working on the article that was going to be a shortened version of Peter Burns' investigation, which I think really gives the lie to the idea that, they really wanted to publish Peter's article. No, they did not. Or there was somebody at the Chronicle, possibly Willie Brown, who made sure that that article didn't get published. I'd love to know what was going on. The other thing I forgot to mention is that I'm very concerned about the increased level of violence, of police violence, that we've all seen. On November 9th, of course, students and aged professors like the poet Robert Haas and his wife were beaten by the cops, and they were in full riot gear. They were in battle gear. That's not accidental. Max Blumenthal did an article recently, which you really should look up. Max Blumenthal Israelification. Just put that into Google. You'll come into Max's article. The Israelis were training and are training U.S. police in more effective means of crowd control. Very violent forms, and they held a training session with the campus cops on the UC campus about 3 weeks before the students and professors were beaten on November 9th. This is it's very, very lucrative. It was done under the aegis of a program called Urban Shield. Urban Shield. Google that too. You'll see the trade show that they had at the Alameda County Fairgrounds before the beatings, and about all of the products that they have for sale. My favorite is handcuffs in designer colors, rainbow colors. So you can get them in any kind of color, but every kind of mace that you can imagine, tear gas launchers, which can be aimed at people's heads, for example. All of this stuff is very lucrative. And what committee does Senator Dianne Feinstein sit on? The Senate Intelligence Committee. And Chancellor Birgeneau has boasted several times that he's been in regular communication with Senator Feinstein about the proper use of the campus police in crowd control. It's beginning to come into focus, actually. Oh, and that didn't, of course, count the appalling actions of the cops at Davis. That cop and that chancellor should have been immediately fired for what they did to those students there. I was glad to see in the Chronicle yesterday that the students are not going to be charged for being doused with chemical. I hope that they're under medical surveillance, because I wouldn't be at all surprised if what they got is going to cause lasting effects on their health. Anyway, thank you very much.